So next we're going to hear from Miranda, Alfonso Williams. And I have to say that really Colin and Miranda have really made this event happen today. You're going to see them working together in the workshop this afternoon, but the outreach that they've done and the conceptual process with me has just been fantastic. Miranda, she's a data privacy and cybersecurity specialist, currently principal consultant for WOM Consulting Group. She provides training, virtual consulting, and auditing. She's board certified in IT security, privacy, and holds an MBA from the University of Phoenix. Miranda has over 20 years' experience in healthcare with the following companies: GE Healthcare, Amersham Health, Nycomed, and Sterling Drug. She has specialized in developing global programs and working with cross-functional teams.
Thanks, Joanne. The check's in the mail. So, as Joanne said, I've been at this for a while, and one of the things I've seen kind of evolve over the years is that, and Suzanne will talk about some of this later, is the rate of the regulations keeping up with innovation. It has not happened, and I'm not sure if they'll ever catch up, because I think I've been in meetings with some of the brightest minds in the world in the way of scientists, researchers, anything you can think of for the most part. And usually they get this wonderful idea about something that they'd like to innovate. And just kind of looking back to our friend here, just the vision he had with regard to healthcare and just kind of combining the technology with the biology, this was something that was a vision a long time ago. And we're finally seeing it come into fruition in various forms. So that said, we kind of look at the marketplace and we see the evolution that's occurring just around the globe. So here we have the States, we have the EU, Japan, and you can see here just kind of the dollars. I think it's projected in 2020 that this space will be about 117 billion, the value. So obviously there's lots of opportunity in terms of growth and how we move forward with really improving healthcare outcomes. That's why all this advancement is occurring. Now, kind of looking back to the whole HIPAA era and where we are today, one of the things that I've kind of observed even now is that in terms of compliance, a lot of organizations are not really sure how to operationalize HIPAA. So even though now the regulation's been around for a while, there are still organizations that are kind of lagging behind, and I think we see that with the number of breaches that are occurring of late. I think the last one that I recall was from UCLA and UCLA Hospital, and I think there were like about 4 million records compromised. So over the last year, there have been significant number of breaches, and it seems like the numbers are getting larger and larger. Now, part of the challenge is that now, because of high tech, there's a requirement to report those breaches, and depending on the nature of the breach and the quantity, anything over 500 needs to be reported to Health and Human Services. So when we look at the regulatory landscape, so here we look at the dollars, and we don't really have much regulation, and I think Colin kind of alluded to that. We have HIPAA, and I'll talk about some of the stuff going on in Europe. But in terms of just kind of a global position, a global posture, it doesn't exist. But the market is there. Now, the challenge with this is that, okay, so these are the different categories. So this is what I'll call the device landscape. So there's essentially 4 different categories that it falls in today, and this will probably continue to expand. But we have the monitoring piece. So you see these different things that kind of monitor I think some people probably are familiar with monitoring your heart rate, blood pressure, et cetera. We have wearables. Wearables can be something like pumps. I think Colin talked about insulin pumps. And then now there's this category of like embedded devices. So as this field expands, we're going to see more embedded devices. And the future is very bright in terms of what's going to be available. And then, of course, there's stationary devices. That can be anything from monitoring, the cardio rate for somebody that may be bedridden. So this is pretty exciting because now what it's doing, it's enabling us as consumers, as patients, to be more in control of our own health. So we're going to see more of this. And kind of the way you look at medicine today is kind of really going to be evolving where patients are going to be more self-sufficient. That's kind of where this is all going. So there's a lot of work going on to make this a reality. So just imagine one day when a woman can actually wear a bra like this. This is a sports bra that has sensors that kind of monitors variances in temperature. So this is kind of one of the things that, we have researchers working on. And, they're aggregating all kinds of data. And one day this will happen, one day this will be a good story. So there's a lot of great ideas out there. We look at sensors. So imagine that little device there is like a computer. And imagine just the amount of information that it can amass over time to tell a story about our health, and then help the doctor to better manage whatever's going on with us. So just kind of some of the things that are being looked at now. It's kind of like passive data gathering. The physicians can have more a meaningful interpretation. And then these sensors, they basically can be attached to the organs. So as this field evolves, I think even, I gave cancer as an example, but even somebody with Alzheimer's, imagine one day being able to implant one of these sensors in their brains and being able to get better outcomes and maybe even start managing that sooner. So the good news is that the technology is there. There are researchers working on it. Again, here, this sensor, it will monitor your vitals just by a touch versus, the blood pressure cup and all the rigmarole we go through today. So even a patient, and again, becoming more involved with the management of their own care. So as we look at the evolution, we'll see more of that. We'll hear more about this. And just here you look at the ecosystem. Now you have like all these things that monitor, like there's the Apple Watch. So there's tons of apps that give you the ability to monitor, whether it be running, things of that nature. So there's a bunch of what we call data points that are being collected in that process. So that's something it's good because the more information that can be collected, the physician can remotely or virtually make better predictions and intervene quicker. The not so good news about this is that also hackers, if we don't have the appropriate controls, can access the same exact information. So now we're going more wireless. So as these things are being developed, we need to make sure that the researchers and scientists, et cetera, are also incorporating upfront the controls because this data is very valuable to hackers. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So this whole concept of big data, we've been hearing that buzzword for years now. So, again, it's regardless of the industry, the idea is to amass as much information as possible so that we can really make predictions. So in healthcare, if we're able to predict outcomes for specific conditions, that's obviously a good story. Now, depending on the type of information being collected, if we're collecting what we call PHI, so anything that relates to an individual, a name, their social security number, their healthcare ID, et cetera, when it's being used for good, it's good. But then on the other side, there's a huge market for this stuff. So we need to make sure that it's really secured properly. Another challenge with this whole concept of the Internet of Things is privacy. And privacy, depending on where you sit in the world, looks a little bit different. So here in the United States, basically what's guiding us is HIPAA and high tech. So that's kind of what's driving the landscape. However, as cybersecurity evolves, we're not keeping pace with the rate of innovation, like I said before. So it poses a challenge. So let's say that somebody is, they're being monitored, like let's say when that brawl becomes a reality. So they're not only collecting data points that relate to that, the temperature changes and able to diagnose the cancer, but let's say that they're collecting other variables, name, et cetera, and even the diagnosis. I was someplace a few years ago that did, they interpret cancer results. So it was a lab that interpreted the cancer results. So can you imagine going into the lab and seeing all the results there with the patient's name, the patient's address, the patient's age, et cetera? That's one of the huge privacy concerns, like what's available, who has access to it, how is it secured, and if those things are not considered up front, it creates a huge issue. And even today, we see that with some of the breaches that occur. Just last year, I think Colin talked about China. With community health systems, that happened, I believe, was last year, like, I want to say August, September. And it was 4.5 million records were compromised. So imagine that kind of information getting into the hands of the Chinese. What they were really after was intellectual property. They ended up getting patient information, or names, really. They didn't get, like, medical ID or anything like that. But even with the names, that's something that can be sold on what we call the dark web, the deep web. And it's quite lucrative, actually. So it's just something to think about, you know, as we have these discussions. What I always recommend is that these kind of discussions need to happen up front. I'm usually called when there's a problem, and it's usually much more expensive to fix it at the tail end than to do it at the front end. So particularly now that there's all this collaboration and innovation, similar to what Colin said, you know, the security people, they kind of look the other way. They do the same with the privacy people, but we're able to tell our stakeholders exactly, just even from a regulatory perspective, what they can do. I mean, you can do X in the United States, but if you're going to be in Europe, if you're going to be in the UK versus Germany versus France, the rules are different. So now with this whole global marketplace, we saw what the market's going to look like. Those are things to consider in part of the planning. And then security. Colin spoke about this specifically, but let's, again, going back to the example of the sensor being embedded in the brain one day, or even with that bra that can one day detect cancer. What kind of controls are in there that would prevent a hacker from intercepting the information that's being aggregated and possibly, you know, doing something with that information? I mean, what's happening now is they sell it. And I'll share some of the figures on what they make in terms of dollars to sell that information, and why we see so much of this activity occurring. So here is a perfect example, like, where's your data? Most large companies, I come from GE, so obviously GE was all over the world. And again, depending on where you are in the world, the rules are different. So it's something that really needs to be factored into the equation. And I mentioned the US, so these are kind of a patchwork of all the different privacy type laws that are here in the United States. We see Canada, the UK. So you just see kind of a patchwork all over the world in terms of how they manage privacy. And I think even just in terms of philosophy, the philosophy regarding privacy is very different in, let's say, the EU than it is here. In the EU, even though the United States has all these different laws, they don't deem us as having adequate protections, if you will, because it is such a patchwork, whereas they have one overarching, they call it the EU directive, which will eventually become a regulation, which kind of governs everything. Privacy is seen as a fundamental right. So anytime we're transferring data for somebody that's like in any EU country, let's say, into the United States, we need to make sure that there's certain controls in place before that can happen. So as these types of technologies continue to grow and advance, it's imperative that, you know, that thought process is put into it, because again, looking at that huge marketplace, the potential is great. So not only do we want to make sure we're protecting the patient from a safety perspective, but also from a privacy perspective so that their identity is not stolen. Someone over here said their identity was stolen. But the other big thing that's occurring is medical ID theft. So what's happening with medical ID theft is that a hacker will, I'll use UCLA as an example because not only did they get the names, but they also got the medical IDs. I believe they had, I want to say they had social. So I'm going to show you a chart that's going to give you an example of how much they can make selling that information on the black market. And right now, healthcare in general is probably the #1 target. There was a time that yes?
I just have a question. What is the use case for the purchaser of medical identification? I'm just curious as to what do they use it for?
Several things.
You would at some point.
Okay. So, just looking here, I mentioned that healthcare right now is the #1 target. It was financial services. I think financial services is getting a whole lot better at managing it, and I think just because of certain regulations, PCI, and just more stringent standards. Not that it doesn't happen, because it certainly does. We saw that with Target. But I think that the information for healthcare, you'll see, is more lucrative than it is for financial services. So just to answer that question, so healthcare, like I said, for a record, a hacker can get, or actually to manage the whole process, it can cost as much as $363 per record if this is compromised. And that includes the whole remediation cost, if they have to get insurance, if they have to fix the problem, or even if they have to report it and notification and everything of that nature. So it can be a very expensive proposition. So do the math on the $4.5 million, I believe it was, for UCLA, if they didn't have insurance or something to kind of defray the cost. So here's a fact. Criminal attacks on healthcare organizations are up 125% just in the last 5 years, and you'll see why in a couple of minutes. The problem has increased so much that the FBI issued a warning to the healthcare industry just to be more resilient, because with the healthcare industry in general, the amount of security and controls, I think it's a lot more lax. And I think because they haven't experienced the breaches as much as financial services, that's changing. And it's increased so much when I talk about these numbers like 4.5 million. It's like, if you go back over just the last year, there's something called the HIPAA wall of shame. And Dr. Schwartz may talk about that this afternoon. But it kind of lists all the reportable breaches that have occurred. And that number just continues to grow. Actually, each day, forget each month, each day. So the question was, so why would somebody want to steal healthcare information? So there's really three or four main reasons. #1 is medical ID theft. So what they can do is they can either use the information to use someone else's medical ID for their own treatment, or secondly, what they can do is they can sell it so somebody else can use it on this black market that I'm talking about. Third thing, and one of the things that we've seen happen is they'll use someone else's medical information to buy like a lot of this huge medical equipment and sell it on the dark web. And that equipment, for those of you who know about like surgical equipment, these monitoring devices, they're very expensive. And the challenge with medical ID theft is that oftentimes the victim may never even find out. I mean, unlike a credit card when it gets breached, if you have a good credit card company, they're gonna notify you pretty quickly. If you don't look at your medical statements, you really wouldn't know. And I think there's a lot of people who don't look at their statements. There's also the piece of just because of depending on the information that's in there, they can use it for just regular ID theft. So it's lucrative. You'll see in a minute how much they can get for it on the black market. So here goes the numbers that can be earned from different types of information that's breached. So if a hacker were to get a social security number, and they sold it on the dark web, and when I say the dark web, there's this whole portion of the internet that's not accessible through like a Google search or through one of the typical browsers. You have to use something like, there's a browser called Tor. So that's where you can see or access this type of information. And what they do is it's literally like a marketplace. So imagine it's like an Amazon with stuff like this on it that's been stolen. So this just gives you an idea. I'm not going to go through each of the numbers, but what would be the motivation for them doing this? And if you do the math, you could see it adds up very quickly. Even if you, one record. So what do we do about it? One of the things that I've found, and I've mentioned this before, is that oftentimes someone like me is not really pulled into the equation until there's a problem. And usually when that happens, it's not that it's not fixable, but it's really costly to fix it. So one of the things that I always recommend is that in terms of planning these things, so whether we're talking about the development of something emerging like a wearable or something that's embedded, is that not only do you need to have the researchers and scientists at the table, but you need to also have the compliance people, whether it be security, privacy, whatever they're called in your organization, at the table, because they can provide some valuable advice that will not only save you, and I say save you because anything can be breached, anything can be hacked, but the idea is to make it more difficult. The hackers are generally going to go after the low-hanging fruit. So what we want to do is to make this difficult for them. We don't want to make it an easy proposition. So what I typically do is when I'm having these conversations, most people, and I wouldn't expect them to, quite frankly, don't really think about some of the regulatory concerns that I mentioned in terms of even that chart. So I'll ask questions like, okay, in terms of marketing this product, what's what's your strategy in terms of how you want to roll this out? So, and then if it's going to be something there's servers involved or there's hosting involved, what are the ramifications from doing that type of thing? So those kind of questions should happen up front. I know of a situation where there was a company that was actually it was a global company based in their headquarters was someplace in Europe. I want to say it was like Norway or something like that. And what was happening is that their servers, their data centers were all in different parts of Europe. So the data was actually being accessed by people in the United States. And there was no sort of regulatory controls to manage that flow of information, what we call data flows. So essentially, it was a breach according to the different rules of those countries in Europe. So after the fact, that company had to go and mitigate the controls that were in those systems. And it was really a very expensive proposition because I think they bought in one of the big four. So suffice it to say, those companies are not cheap. So something that they could have planned up front, or certainly midterm. One of the things this is kind of a very basic project planning chart, is just security, compliance, all that stuff needs to be part of the overall process. Because I think as projects evolve, what happens is then we realize, okay, well, we wanted to do this. We realized this is not possible. So now we want to do this. And just kind of really, it's like a checkpoint to make sure that there are no regulatory concerns or security concerns, or do we need to kind of change our strategy around security? And security is going to look very different depending on the organization. And I think one of the things with, and Dr. Schwartz will talk about this, I'm sure, later, is even with a HIPAA. Just a lot of organizations struggle with how do you operationalize it because it's just not that prescriptive. So the way that you decide, organization A decides to secure something may be different than organization B. One may say we're going to use encryption, and one may say that we're going to only have encryption, data in transit. Data in motion won't be encrypted. But depending on the type of data, that kind of needs to all factor into the equation. So for those of you who are independents, it's just something just to think about, particularly as we continue to collect more and more information. Like I said, the good news is that where medicine is going, we're going to have better outcomes in the long run. In the short run, there's also a whole industry out there for hackers. And one of the things you can also find on the dark web is, I think one of the most common things occurring now is malware. A lot of these breaches are because of malware. You can actually go to the dark web, and there's a service called, and I think you can probably get it on the regular web now, malware as a service. So if you don't know how to write it, you can find someone to write it for you. So it's you just need to stay really up to date and knowledgeable about what's out there. And the other big thing, it's ransomware. And what that is, you have a hacker, and that's also something that can be purchased on the dark web. You have...
Sorry, are there any good guys controlling the dark web to go after who's...
I'm sure that the FBI is out there, but can they regulate it? Because a lot of these hackers are in other countries. So, I mean, they're out there. I'll go to sites, and some of them, I'm sure, are stings, but I think it's more of a monitoring activity. So the FBI, I mean, I can't say factually, but I'm sure that they're out there. So ransomware. So ransomware, what that is you'll have a hacker who will compromise your system. They'll essentially lock it down so you can't access anything. And then they'll call you up and say, oh, by the way, I've locked down your system. You don't have access to your data. If you want access to your data, either I'm going to delete it or you pay me X dollars. So that's become quite big. And I actually know someone that was recently impacted by this. He owns an architectural firm, and he got one of those phone calls. And the ransomware, because they want money, I think it was like a few $100s, and that's usually what they ask for. So he had to make that decision because he was kind of like one of those old school guys who didn't have backups. So all of his blueprints were on paper. So essentially the paper was his backup. So it's just something to really think about proactively. Ransomware as a service, that's another huge one. And again, you can get this all on the dark web. If you ever want to scare the heck out of yourself, go to the dark web one day, because anything you could imagine that's not legal, you can get it there. So the other piece of this is we want to make sure we go through this whole risk management process, and Colin and I are going to go through this this afternoon. But essentially, you just want to make sure that you kind of identify what the risks are for your particular organization, and for each organization it's going to be different. And then you assess that risk. I mean, is it something that could be a showstopper and bring your business to a crawl? And then we want to also make sure we're just constantly reviewing, and then the appropriate controls, implementing the appropriate controls, because again, it's going to look different for each organization, and then mitigate and monitor that risk. And again, Colin and I will be talking about this in more detail this afternoon, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. And with that, any questions?
Your last slide before this slide here, you mentioned about risk management. I'm very curious, and I'm a professional in information assurance. So what is it that you believe defines a assessment of risk management? I know you're going to talk about it later in the afternoon, but when I think of it, I think of things like the common criteria. I put together a formal threat analysis, but here I don't see the same language that I use.
I think when I think of risk management, I think it's going to depend on the business, because I think you're describing some things that are really IT specific, whereas we're looking at it more holistically from a total business perspective.
So like insurance and
that can
type
be a
of
part
risk?
of it. That can be part of one of the things that's used to mitigate it. I mean, sometimes that is the recommendation, but it can be like, let's say if you have like a software company, and let's say if you have something that's monitoring a heart rate or something like that. If something happens, if you're being hosted in the cloud or something like that, if you weren't able to access that data that related to patients, I would imagine that would be a huge risk for that organization. So I believe that the technical controls that you've mentioned are part of it, but that's only a part of it. I think you kind of look at it even from a management perspective in terms of organizational priorities.
So I might throw out everyone here. It seems to me the greatest risk is the lack of people doing the type of analysis that I am suggesting. So under your risk management, my guess is, and I know there was an Oracle study about 5 years ago, most IT people do not know where their data is. They don't conduct frequent threat analyses. They don't even know what the common criteria is. I
don't think it's just IT. I think I've spoken to small medical practices and I've been in major organizations. So I don't think it's a practice that's just limited there. I think if it's not part of the culture, it's not going to happen. And I think oftentimes organizations are very reactive, so they don't do it. You know, maybe they don't know they need to do it. Like, I mean, HIPAA is a perfect example. I mean, there's I believe it's part of the administrative standards where a risk analysis is supposed to be performed. I don't know that a lot of, just based on what I've observed, that a lot of entities are aware of that.
So ultimately, how do we change the culture?
Just keep talking, keep sharing.
Risk is a very interesting area because when I teach risk, I always use a risk as a function of threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. So if you look at risk, it's indexed to whatever the threat is. The threat is different, whether it's a medical industry, whether it's a critical infrastructure, whatever the nature of the beast is. So risk, in an overall perspective, you have to have a process that looks at what the threats confront whatever entity is, what the vulnerabilities are, and you have to do a good job on that, and then what the consequences are. The consequences are dollar figures.
I'll give you a perfect example. So I mentioned that I used to work for GE. So, and this is all in the public space, so I'm not sharing any secrets. There was part of GE Healthcare, the surgery business specifically, that looking back in retrospect, probably did not go through any risk assessment because essentially the FDA shut them down. So you ask, what are the consequences? Lost revenue, reputational issues. And when you quantify it, it was like millions of dollars, and that business was shut down for quality reasons for, I want to say, a good 3 years. So had they gone through some sort of periodic risk management process, they probably would have been able to diagnose on their own that we have these issues.
I think part of the issue with both the assessing and this that's not the only issue most healthcare organizations have to deal with. Again, I work for a company that is a software. We do a GRC platform, and we've got a lot of different organizations and different verticals using us. And the general problem we find, people have built their own, where they're utilizing a mixture of manual, SharePoint, whatever. They don't get everything together, and they've got so much to do. I've got to do, if I'm a healthcare organization, huge one, I've got PCI, I've probably, okay. I've probably got PCI, HIPAA, NIST, maybe high trust, and I've got to do all of these. So I usually get a representative assessment, which is not good. And then I'm also getting a separate vulnerability and threat issue being pulled in. So I've got all these things all over the place, and I don't have that much time in my day to do it. So I've got to try to pick and choose what I do, and quite often I could be wrong. So this is what I find when we do a demo for an organization. They've got stuff all over the place, and it's too secluded, too sequestered, and the information doesn't come together to give a full risk profile. And I think oftentimes that's part of the issue. as well as the dollar figures that organizations have to try to save and spend at the same time intelligently. And it all ties in with medical devices because all of these things pull into one area. It's one big window, if you will, of data and information to be shared out. And how that all works together just takes so much time. And I did have one question, though. You mentioned something earlier about medical devices also changing the way they look at things, bringing them. That's a quality control issue. Should they be changing their quality control approach to include the issues that are going to involve patients and patient care afterwards?
I think it should be a continuous process where they're continually monitoring it. Because I think just like anything else, you said you're in software, I'm sure that you'll determine that, there's a patch that's necessary at some point. And I think as we become more connected to the internet, if you will, and we see how vulnerable we are to hackers and such, we're going to need to be able to respond. So it's going to be continuous monitoring. And the hackers are becoming more skilled. So you got to almost think like they do if you can. So that said, the monitoring is essential. I just wanted to add to your point, when you're talking about the fragmented information. One of the ways I used to deal with that, and I still deal with that, because most organizations is typically some sort of a resource issue. So I would usually ask the stakeholders to appoint, quote, a deputy. So to make sure we're covering the entire organization, so we weren't kind of working in isolation. So it was not perfect, but it definitely made things a lot better. Otherwise, it's like a guessing game.
So you said something interesting before, as I understood it, kind of the HIPAA wall of shame, right? We hear stories about massive consumer breaches, Targets, and others, right? So what is do you have any data about the real impact, financial impact from a reputation standpoint or repeat business for the general business that is getting hacked or purging information in some way? And maybe a difference between a consumer business versus a B2B whose customers can be a bit more discerning when working with them in the future. So do you have any information about what the real loss is and, more importantly, what these companies can do to regain what they've lost after a breach?
Well, I think you see more, and I think Dr. Schwartz will probably go more into detail about this, is you will see now they're starting to fine companies. Right now, OIG is going through this whole process of audits to make sure that these entities are indeed, they have some sort of a program, some sort of protocol. And I think, generally speaking, they're forgiving if you can demonstrate that you're doing something versus doing nothing. So there's that piece of it. But in terms of fines, I mean, there's a lot of information about fines. Is there an average? I think it depends on how egregious the breach is. Because you look at New York Presbyterian Hospital, I think they were fined like $4.5 million. There was something recent, just I forget the entity, but it was just in the news in the last few weeks, $400,000. So I think we're seeing, because of high tech also, we're seeing more enforcement activity. Now, are they keeping up? I don't think that the resourcing is there to go after everyone. So I think they're just basically going after the ones who are just being really blatant.
And I guess just to focus that more, though, I mean, do customers penalize the companies, who are breached? Are they stopping work with some of these vendors who have had, a major cybersecurity, issue or a threat that's been exploited?
I think that sometimes, if you look at Target after that breach occurred, right, you saw a hit to their share price. Right. But now I think they're back where they were before, if not stronger. So I think people have what I call breach fatigue. We just keep hearing so much about it. So now, like this one with the 4 million, it's like if let's say 5,000 records are compromised, it's that's nothing.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. I guess it's so commonplace now. Yeah. Do consumers even care? Do many customers care, or do they just assume it's going to happen at some point and they're putting less out there?
I think they should assume, or we should assume, it's going to happen. I always tell organizations it's not if you get breached, when you get breached, are you prepared to manage it?
So fines are really the best way to help.
Yeah, I think OIG just started this whole
What's OIG?
Office of Inspector General. Sorry about that. They've just started, this is the second year, and I know that they've increased the number of breaches, the number of investigations, but again, I think it's I don't know what the formula is, But I think there's a lot more that will just over the years it will just become more commonplace. It's just not there yet. So there has been enforcement activity, just not as much as we probably should be seeing, because I think that changes behavior. When an organization, when it hits their pocket, it changes behavior.
I just wanted to comment. Okay, I just wanted to comment on the slide and to this gentleman's point. Especially in the smaller companies, they don't go through this risk management process. And I've been in the insurance industry for 40 years, and most of it has been on the risk management side, on the corporate side. This is my first job on the insurance broker side, but a lot of small companies and even large companies, I was laid off from a $4 billion revenue pharmaceutical that decided to outsource risk management. And so they look at in risk management as purely insurance. So they don't go through this identify, assess, review, control, and mitigate because we have insurance. And when you ask them about insurance, we have all risk insurance. Everything is covered. And then you say, well, insurance policies have exclusions. Oh, they do? You know, and so if you don't go through this, it's just, as this gentleman said, you know, you really are leaving yourself very much exposed.
I would agree with that. I know that we've been, this will be my last statement. We being one of the companies I work for, we had different types of insurance as well. And I remember that the insurance carrier would come in and audit us to ensure that, you know, the X, Y, and Z was in place. So I think it depends on how the insurance contract is structured.
And I'm going to retire soon, so I want to know the ransomware website.